The young and the restless spoilers Victor Newman had survived wars, corporate, personal, emotional. He had battled enemies in boardrooms, in bedrooms, and in back alleys of Genoa City's darkest secrets. But as he stepped out of the luxury car onto the cobblestone driveway of a sprawling chateau nestled deep within the hills of Nice, France, he had the strangest feeling that this time, the battlefield was unfamiliar and that his instincts, so sharp, so unflinching for decades, were brushing against the edges of something he couldn't yet name. Cain Ashby, the prodigal son turned phantom turned self-made mystery, had summoned the city's titans to his estate with the precision of a man who understood leverage. And leverage was something Victor always respected, until now. Now, he wasn't sure whether this invitation was a gesture of alliance or a snare designed to spring. The moment he crossed through the towering iron gates, flanked by security guards who looked far too serious for a celebration, Victor felt the atmosphere close in like a fist around his chest. Something was wrong. The air was rich with French wine, laughter, and luxury, but it was the wrong kind of laughter, the kind that came with undertones of secrets, of games unfolding behind velvet curtains. And it wasn't just Victor who noticed. Jack Abbott, who had reluctantly accepted the invitation, exchanged a knowing glance with Billy the moment they arrived. This wasn't just a party. This was a power move. And they were all pieces on the board. The first real clue came in the form of silence, not between people, but between phones. No service. Not one guest could get a single bar of reception. They laughed it off at first, joked about ancient walls and French countryside cell towers, but deep down, they all knew better. These were billionaires, moguls, legacy holders. None of them took trips without signal. And Cain had picked this location for a reason. He didn't need to explain it because the absence of explanation said more than words ever could. Isolation was a strategy. One by one, Genoa City's power players realized they had walked willingly into a trap, or at the very least, into a narrative they weren't controlling. Victor was already suspicious of Cain before the event. He had refused to partner with him weeks earlier, citing lack of transparency. Cain had been persistent, asking what it would take to change Victor's mind, but the answer had always been the same, truth. And Cain had delivered everything but that. Now, watching him weave between guests, offering toasts and anecdotes with charm too polished to be real, Victor realized that whatever truth Cain had been hiding wasn't going to be whispered. It would crash down like a guillotine. And Victor wasn't sure who would be beneath the blade. Jack, meanwhile, found himself studying the layout of the chateau like a crime scene, memorizing exits, analyzing security, counting staff. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. And Jack knew one thing with certainty: Cain wasn't hosting a business summit. He was staging something else entirely. The question wasn't what Cain wanted. The question was why now, and why here? As dusk bled into evening, the energy shifted. Guests were beginning to murmur. Lauren Fenmore and Michael Baldwin, who had arrived late after navigating the maze-like gardens, sensed it immediately. "Did we miss something?" Lauren asked, but the answer wasn't just in the whispered gossip, it was in the eyes of those who had stopped trusting the wine being served. Even Nikki Newman grew visibly unsettled, her smile frozen in place, her gaze flickering between Cain and the heavily guarded wings of the estate. Abby found herself face to face with Chance Chancellor once again, her ex-husband, who claimed he had received a last-minute invitation. But why would Cain want a former detective here unless he expected something messy? And worse, Chance wasn't even sure who sent the invite. He wasn't here by design. He was here by manipulation. Just like everyone else. And then came the scream. Sharp, brief, distant. A female voice, not recognizable but unmistakably terrified. The music didn't stop immediately. The staff didn't react. That was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. It was as if the event had been choreographed to ignore alarms. But the guests weren't fools. Victor was already moving toward the hallway from which the sound came, but he was blocked, not aggressively, just enough to make clear that this wasn't his house. Kane appeared almost instantly, apologizing for a false alarm, brushing it off as a wine accident, a staff mishap. But the lie was flimsy, and it was delivered too quickly. Whispers turned into questions. Where were the phones? Why was no one allowed into the east wing of the chateau? Why had multiple guests reported seeing the same shadowy figure moving past their rooms at night? Why had a guest from another business faction, someone no one had seen in over a day, suddenly stopped appearing, even at meals? Back in Genoa City, things were unraveling. The media had begun to question the sudden disappearance of so many key players. With no statements, no press releases, and no updates, speculation soared. Stock prices of Newman Enterprises and Jabot began to sway. An anonymous tip to the press claimed that a hostile corporate takeover was underway, led by unknown entities exploiting the absence of Genoa's most influential executives. The city's power vacuum was being filled by shadows. And still, no one could reach France. Victor paced his guest quarters, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and facial expressions. He didn't trust Kane. He hadn't for a long time. But now, he was beginning to wonder whether this was more than arrogance or ambition. This felt like a setup. A stage. And he was the star of a play that might end in scandal, or worse, incarceration. Because that scream? It hadn't been a mistake. And hours later, when a body was discovered near the southern vineyard, partially concealed, lifeless, the alarm bells turned into sirens, only no one could hear them beyond the estate walls. Victor was the last person seen near that section of the estate. Witnesses, whose names couldn't be confirmed, claimed they saw him walking in the direction of the gardens moments before the scream. And suddenly, the murmurs became accusations. The body, when identified, belonged to a woman who had worked briefly for Chancellor Winters years earlier, someone with known ties to a former Newman board member. The connection was thin but sinister in the wrong hands. And Kane had the wrong hands. By the following morning, French authorities arrived. Their presence was explained as routine. Security. Formality. But Victor knew better. He was questioned privately, then publicly. Nikki wasn't allowed to see him. Jack's attempts to intervene were shut down. Chance tried to offer his former credentials to help mediate, but even he was pushed aside. Michael Baldwin, now shifting from guest to legal defense, stepped into the fire as Victor's representative. But it was clear Victor Newman was being framed. And the stage had been set days in advance. Kane vanished the moment the investigation began. His staff denied knowing his location. His personal guards were suddenly off duty. The man who had orchestrated the entire affair had evaporated into the fog of suspicion, leaving behind only breadcrumbs. And the guests realized the truth too late. Kane hadn't brought them to France to build alliances. He had brought them to eliminate obstacles, to fracture loyalties, and to watch as empires fell while he watched from the shadows. Genoa City was now bleeding influence, its companies targeted, its media swarmed. While Victor Newman faced murder allegations in a foreign country, his enemies at home moved swiftly. Anonymous buyers acquired shares. Audra Charles and Tucker McCall seized the narrative. Rumors circulated that Victoria Newman had been ousted in a boardroom ambush, while Kyle Abbott had taken control of Jabot in Jack's absence. Every domino was falling exactly where Kane needed it to fall. And still, no one knew what he ultimately wanted. Power? Revenge? Redemption? Or was Kane Ashby simply proving that the ghosts of Genoa City's past had teeth, and that when they returned, they didn't knock on doors? They kicked them in. Would you like me to continue this story with Victor's legal battle in France, Nikki and Michael trying to save him, and Lily discovering the truth about Kane's real plan? I can develop the next part seamlessly. There was always something theatrical about Kane Ashby. Even in his most humble years, there had been a flicker behind his eyes that hinted at a man playing a much larger game than anyone around him realized. And now, standing at the heart of a centuries-old French chateau with the most powerful figures of Genoa City under his roof, that flicker had evolved into a blazing inferno of calculation and ambition. This wasn't just a party. It wasn't even an event. It was a trap. A meticulously orchestrated stage designed to destroy legacies and unmask truths that had been buried for far too long. And at the center of it all stood Victor Newman, completely unaware that he was the sacrificial king in a game Kane had been preparing for years. The invitations had been a stroke of brilliance, extended to everyone with influence, from Jack Abbott to Billy, from Lauren Fenmore to Michael Baldwin, from Abby to Chance, and even to the occasionally dangerous Audra Charles. But none of them were truly important. They were window dressing, distractions, necessary noise to hide the real orchestration. Kane had only ever wanted one man here, Victor Newman. The rest were pawns, observers, hostages of luxury and spectacle. And by the time they realized it, the doors were locked and the phones were dead. Kane didn't need all of them. He just needed them to watch. To be witnesses. To feel powerless. To know they couldn't stop what was coming. Victor had, of course, rejected Kane's offer outright. The idea of trading Dumas properties for control over Chancellor Industries had felt absurd, even insulting. Victor, with all his decades of power and strategic ruthlessness, hadn't even entertained the numbers. And Nikki had backed him immediately, reminding him that Catherine Chancellor would have never allowed such a transaction. To sell the soul of Chancellor to a man like Kane? Unthinkable. Even Nick, who had grown more cynical in recent years, had aligned with his parents. The Newmans stood united, resolute. They believed, as always, that no one could break them. And that's where they were wrong. Because Kane hadn't built his plan around the assumption that Victor would say yes. He'd built it assuming Victor would say no. That had always been the likelier path. Kane had accounted for it. He had counted on it. The offer had been a test, a public gesture, a red herring. The real plan, his true strategy, was already unfolding behind the walls of the estate, in rooms the guests never entered, involving transactions they couldn't trace, and deals they would only learn about once it was far too late. Victor had underestimated him. That was his first mistake. The second was assuming that Kane's fixation on Chancellor was about business. It wasn't. It was about legacy. Kane had spent a lifetime being treated as expendable. The adopted son, the outsider, the man whose achievements were always measured against what he wasn't. Not a Chancellor by blood. Not a Newman by strength. Not an Abbott by prestige. But he had changed that. The Dumas identity had not just been a mask, it had been a mirror. Under its guise, he had built wealth, respect, and fear. And now, as he returned under his real name, Kane was ready to claim not just his place at the table, but the whole damn table. His endgame was elegant. Trap Victor at the chateau with a murder scandal that couldn't be easily disproved, leverage the ensuing chaos to destabilize Newman Enterprises back home, and activate operatives waiting silently across Genoa City to dismantle the infrastructure that held Victor's empire together. Audra had already moved into position at Newman Media. Tucker had begun circling vulnerable subsidiaries like a vulture over fresh carrion. Shareholders were being fed just enough misinformation to stir panic. Every denial only fueled the storm. Victor, isolated and under suspicion, could do nothing to stop it. But Kane didn't stop there. He seeded personal betrayals into the mix, aimed directly at Victor's psychological blind spots. He had private investigators deliver falsified documents to the French authorities implicating Victor in the Vineyard death. He had arranged for Michael Baldwin's legal credentials to be questioned on a technicality, limiting his ability to represent Victor effectively in France. He even sent anonymous leads to tabloids suggesting Nikki Newman had financially benefited from a secret offshore account connected to the Dumas portfolio, placing a wedge between husband and wife. It was sabotage layered with precision, designed not just to break Victor's company, but to unmoor his world. And the worst part? Victor still hadn't realized who was helping Kane from the inside. Back in Genoa City, while the Newmans were trapped abroad, Lily Winters was beginning to see the cracks in the narrative. For weeks, she had tried to give Kane the benefit of the doubt, remembering the man who once shared her bed, her children, her dreams. But the man orchestrating this chaos didn't resemble the one she loved. And yet, it wasn't a stranger either. That was the horror of it. The cold ambition. The ability to weaponize love and loyalty. Lily found herself torn between exposing him and protecting what little good she thought might remain. But as news trickled in about Victor's detainment and Chancellor's stock being leveraged in offshore shell companies, she knew, whatever Kane was doing, it was not for the family they used to be. Even Jack Abbott, no stranger to games of legacy and revenge, began to fear the scope of what Kane had unleashed. What began as a personal vendetta was morphing into a corporate war with no borders. He suspected Kane had acquired a list of key shareholders from a hacked file in Jabot's system, and that someone on his own board had leaked it. The thought made his stomach churn. He'd seen business turn brother against brother, but this was biblical. And somewhere in the estate, behind walls laced with secrets, Kane sat in a hidden room, watching the surveillance feeds. He saw Victor pacing. He saw Jack arguing with Nikki. He saw Chance trying to make sense of the forensic inconsistencies in the murder investigation. And he smiled. This wasn't just revenge. This was revelation. He wasn't punishing them for their power. He was showing them what it meant to have it taken away. Slowly. Publicly. Permanently. Because in Kane's eyes, the real crime wasn't that Victor refused his offer. It was that Victor never saw him as a threat in the first place. And soon, neither Victor Newman, nor Chancellor Industries, nor the fractured remnants of Newman Enterprises would ever recover from that mistake. Would you like the next part to focus on how Victor escapes, or fails to escape the trap? Or perhaps how Lily, Jack, or Michael try to stop the collapse? I can develop this further into an even larger story arc.